Chapter 5. He awoke next morning from rosy scenes of dream to a steamy atmosphere that smelled of soapsuds and dirty clothes, and that was vibrant with the jar and jangle of tormented life. As he came out of his room, he heard the slosh of water, a sharp exclamation, and a resounding smack as his sister visited her irritation upon one of her numerous progeny. The squall of the child went through him like a knife. He was aware that the whole thing, the very air he breathed, was repulsive and mean. How different, he thought, from the atmosphere of beauty and repose of the house wherein Ruth dwelt. There it was all spiritual. Here it was all material, and meanly material. "Come here, Alfred," he called to the crying child, at the same time thrusting his hand into his trousers pocket, where he carried his money loose in the same large way that he lived life in general. He put a quarter in the youngster's hand, and held him in his arms a moment, soothing his sobs. "Now run along and get some candy, and don't forget to give some to your brothers and sisters. Be sure and get the kind that lasts longest." His sister lifted a flushed face from the wash-tub and looked at him. "A nickel'd have been enough," she said. "It's just like you, no idea of the value of money. The child'll eat himself sick." "That's all right, sis," he answered jovially. "My money'll take care of itself. If you weren't so busy, I'd kiss you good morning." He wanted to be affectionate to his sister, who was good, and who, in her way, he knew, loved him. But somehow she grew less herself as the years went by, and more baffling. It was the hard work, the many children, and the nagging of her husband, he decided, that had changed her. It came to him in a flash of fancy that her nature seemed taking on the attributes of stale vegetables, smelly soap-suds, and of the greasy dimes, nickels, and quarters she took in over the counter of the store. "Go along and get your breakfast," she said roughly, though secretly pleased. Of all her wandering brood of brothers, he had always been her favorite. "I declare I will kiss you," she said, with a sudden stir at her heart. With thumb and forefinger she swept the dripping suds first from one arm and then from the other. He put his arms around her massive waist and kissed her wet, steamy lips. The tears welled into her eyes, not so much from strength of feeling as from the weakness of chronic overwork. She shoved him away from her, but not before he caught a glimpse of her moist eyes. "You'll find breakfast in the oven," she said hurriedly. "Jim ought to be up now. I had to get up early for the washing. Now get along with you and get out of the house early. It won't be nice today, what of Jim quittin' and nobody but Bernard to drive the wagon." Martin went into the kitchen with a sinking heart, the image of her red face and slatternly form eating its way like acid into his brain. She might love him if she only had some time, he concluded, but she was worked to death. Bernard Higginbotham was a brute to work her so hard. But he could not help but feel, on the other hand, that there had not been anything beautiful in that kiss. It was true, it was an unusual kiss. For years she had kissed him only when he returned from voyages or departed on voyages. But this kiss had tasted soap-suds, and the lips, he had noticed, were flabby. There had been no quick, vigorous lip pressure, such as should accompany any kiss. Hers was the kiss of a tired woman who had been tired so long that she had forgotten how to kiss. He remembered her as a girl, before her marriage, when she would dance with the best all night, after a hard day's work at the laundry, and think nothing of leaving the dance to go to another day's hard work. And then he thought of Ruth, and the cool sweetness that must reside in her lips, as it resided in all about her. Her kiss would be like her handshake, or the way she looked at one, firm and frank. In imagination he dared to think of her lips on his, and so vividly did he imagine that he went dizzy at the thought, and seemed to rift through clouds of rose petals, filling his brain with their perfume. In the kitchen he found Jim, the other boarder, eating mush very languidly, with a sick, far-away look in his eyes. Jim was a plumber's apprentice, whose weak chin and hedonistic temperament, coupled with a certain nervous stupidity, promised to take him nowhere in the race for bread and butter. "Why don't you eat?" he demanded, as Martin dipped dolefully into the dark, half-cooked oatmeal mush. "Was you drunk again last night?" Martin shook his head. He was oppressed by the utter squalidness of it all. Ruth Morse seemed farther removed than ever. "I was," Jim went on with a boastful, nervous giggle. "I was loaded right to the neck. Oh, and she was a daisy. Billy brought me home." Martin nodded that he heard. It was a habit of nature with him to pay heed to whoever talked to him, and poured a cup of lukewarm coffee. "Going to the Lotus Club dance tonight?" Jim demanded. "They're going to have beer, and if that Temescal bunch comes, there'll be a rough house. I don't care, though. I'm taking my lady friend just the same. Cripes, but I've got a taste in my mouth." He made a wry face and attempted to wash the taste away with coffee. "Do you know Julia?" Martin shook his head. "She's my lady friend," Jim explained, "and she's a peach. I'd introduce you to her, only you'd win her. I don't see what the girls see in you. Honest, I don't. But the way you win them away from the fellers is sickening." "I never got any away from you," Martin answered uninterestedly. "The breakfast had to be got through somehow." "Yes, you did, too," the other asserted warmly. "There was Maggie." "Never had anything to do with her. Never danced with her except that one night." "Yes, and that's just what did it," Jim cried out. "You just danced with her and looked at her, and it was all off. Of course you didn't mean nothing by it, but it settled me for keeps. Wouldn't look at me again, always asking about you. She'd have made fast dates enough with you if you'd wanted to. But I didn't want to. Wasn't necessary. I was left at the pole." Jim looked at him admiringly. "How do you do it anyway, Mart?" "By not caring about him," was the answer. "You mean making believe you don't care about him?" Jim queried eagerly. Martin considered for a moment, then answered. "Perhaps that will do, but with me I guess it's different. I never have cared much. If you can put it on, it's all right, most likely." "You should have been up at Riley's barn last night," Jim announced inconsequently. "A lot of the fellers put on the gloves. There was a peach from West Oakland. They called him the Rat, slick as silk. No one could touch him. We was all wishing you was there. Where was you, anyway?" "Down in Oakland," Martin replied. "To the show?" Martin shoved his plate away and got up. "Coming to the dance tonight?" the other called after him. "No, I think not," he answered. He went downstairs and out into the street, breathing great breaths of air. He had been suffocating in that atmosphere, while the apprentice's chatter had driven him frantic. There had been times when it was all he could do to refrain from reaching over and mopping Jim's face in the mush plate. The more he had chattered, the more remote had Ruth seemed to him. How could he, herding with such cattle, ever become worthy of her? He was appalled at the problem confronting him, weighted down by the incubus of his working-class station. Everything reached out to hold him down. His sister's house and family, Jim the apprentice, everybody he knew, every tie of life. Existence did not taste good in his mouth. Up to then he had accepted existence, as he had lived with it all about him, as a good thing. He had never questioned it, except when he read books. But then, they were only books, fairy stories of a fairer and impossible world. But now he had seen that world, possible and real, with a flower of a woman called Ruth in the midmost center of it, and thenceforth he must know bitter tastes, and longing sharp as pain, and hopelessness that tantalized because it fed on hope. He had debated between the Berkeley Free Library and the Oakland Free Library, and decided upon the latter because Ruth lived in Oakland. Who could tell? A library was a most likely place for her, and he might see her there. He did not know the way of libraries, and he wandered through endless rows of fiction, till the delicate-featured, French-looking girl who seemed in charge told him that the reference department was upstairs. He did not know enough to ask the man at the desk, and began his adventures in the philosophy alcove. He had heard of book philosophy, but had not imagined there had been so much written about it. The high, bulging shelves of heavy tomes humbled him, and at the same time stimulated him. Here was work for the vigor of his brain. He found books on trigonometry in the mathematics section, and ran the pages, and stared at the meaningless formulas and figures. He could read English, but he saw there an alien speech. Norman and Arthur knew that speech. He had heard them talking it, and they were her brothers. He left the alcove in despair. From every side the book seemed to press upon him and crush him. He had never dreamed that the fund of human knowledge bulked so big. He was frightened. How could his brain ever master it all? Later, he remembered that there were other men, many men, who had mastered it, and he breathed a great oath, passionately, under his breath, swearing that his brain could do what theirs had done. And so he walked on, alternating between depression and elation, as he stared at the shelves packed with wisdom. In one miscellaneous section he came upon Norrie's Epitome. He turned the pages reverently. In a way, it spoke a kindred speech. Both he and it were of the sea. Then he found a Bowditch, and the books by Lecky and Marshall. There it was. He would teach himself navigation. He would quit drinking, work up, and become a captain. Ruth seemed very near to him in that moment. As a captain, he could marry her, if she would have him. And if she wouldn't, well, he would live a good life among men, because of her. And he would quit drinking anyway. Then he remembered the underwriters and the owners, the two masters a captain must serve, either of which could and would break him, and whose interests were diametrically opposed. He cast his eyes about the room and closed the lids down on a vision of 10,000 books. No more of the sea for him. There was power in that wealth of books, and if he would do great things, he must do them on the land. Besides, captains were not allowed to take their wives to sea with them. Noon came, and afternoon. He forgot to eat, and sought on for the books on etiquette, for, in addition to career, his mind was vexed by a simple and very concrete problem. When you meet a young lady and she asks you to call, how soon can you call? Was the way he worded it to himself. But when he found the right shelf, he sought vainly for the answer. He was appalled at the vast edifice of etiquette, and lost himself in the mazes of visiting card conduct between persons in polite society. He abandoned his search. He had not found what he wanted, though he had found that it would take all of a man's time to be polite, and that he would have to live a preliminary life in which to learn how to be polite. "Did you find what you wanted?" The man at the desk asked him as he was leaving. "Yes, sir," he answered. "You have a fine library here." The man nodded. "We should be glad to see you here often. Are you a sailor?" "Yes, sir," he answered, "and I'll come again." Now, how did he know that? He asked himself as he went down the stairs. And for the first block along the street he walked very stiff and straight and awkwardly, until he forgot himself in his thoughts, whereupon his rolling gait gracefully returned to him. End of chapter 5.